The 10th Insight, Chapter 2, Reviewing the Journey, Part 1. Let's start with characters. We have Will, and that's Will from the original book. He makes a comeback. Main character, Charlene, mentioned. David, mentioned, and that's David Lone Eagle from the previous chapter. John Donald Williams, he's the guy who died, and they observed the life review in the afterlife dimension of him. And the souls. Reviewing the Journey. I think the title of this chapter is titled this way as a way to describe the life review and how the life review process helps you see your failures life after life or successes and how we all interact with each other in multiple lifetimes. Now that we're becoming more aware of this, it's hopefully going to lead people to live better lives. And then we get hit with this bombshell. The 10th Insight doesn't exist in this realm of existence. The 10th Insight was never written down. Oh, it exists, but not in the earthly dimension. The insight hasn't made it to the physical plane yet. Knowledge of the 10th Insight exists only in the afterlife dimension. Only when enough people can sense the information intuitively can it become real enough in everyone's consciousness for someone to write it down. The same thing happened with the first 9 insights and all spiritual texts. The information exists in the afterlife and then becomes understood in the physical dimension to be manifested by someone who was supposed to write it down. This is why these writings are called divinely inspired. And if you wondered, why doesn't the 10th exist yet in our dimension? It's because of the fear that arises in a culture that is moving from a material reality to a transformed spiritual worldview. The knowledge has to be grasped in sufficient numbers in order to overcome the fear. And that makes me think of the title of the first insight, a critical mass. A critical mass has to have the same idea in order to bring forth the knowledge. The 10th insight. Just knowing the first 9 is not enough. We have to understand how we will implement this destiny. Such knowledge comes from grasping the special relationship between the physical dimension and the afterlife. We have to understand the birth process, where we come from, the larger picture of what human history is trying to accomplish. The first 9 insights describe the reality of spiritual evolution, both personally and collectively, but actually implementing these insights, living them, and fulfilling this destiny requires a fuller understanding of the process. A 10th insight. This insight would show us the reality of Earth's spiritual transformation, not just from the perspective of the earthly dimension, but from the perspective of the afterlife dimension as well. We would understand more fully why we were uniting the dimensions, why humans must fulfill this historical purpose, and it would be this understanding, once integrated into culture, that would ensure this eventual outcome. The fear. At the same time the new spiritual awareness was emerging, a reactive polarization would also rise up in fearful opposition, seeking to willfully control the future with various new technologies. Technologies even more dangerous than the nuclear menace that are already being discovered. The controllers of society will seize power and exploit the technology for their own purpose. The 10th insight resolves this polarization. We have to understand the fear in order to help resolve it. Here are 2 perspectives on the 10th insight. The first one is understanding the spiritual renaissance on Earth in light of the other dimension and learning the true nature of your intuitions, was David's version. Seeing images, some historical and repeated visions, was that of the main character. Potential future. You receive a mental image of a potential event and then you live it out, bringing on the coincidence of actually discovering the location and encounter. If you shrug it off or lose faith, you miss the synchronicity and your life will stay flat. But if you hold the vision and keep it in your mind, you can then manifest it. Maintain the intuition and understand our intuitions more fully. In the first 9 insights, one experiences intuitions as fleeting gut feelings or vague hunches. But as we gain familiarity with this phenomenon, we can now grasp the nature of these intuitions more clearly. In the first book, the intuitions came to the main character as pictures of what was going to happen, images of himself and others at a specific location doing certain things, leading him to go there. The 10th Insight, Chapter 2, Reviewing the Journey, Part 2. Will's return from the afterlife dimension. The main character reported that Will's hands looked slightly luminescent, but otherwise seemed normal. In Peru, Will increased and maintained his energy level while others grew fearful and lost their vibration, and he found himself in an incredible world of beauty and clear form. He was occupying the same space he had been when people could see him, but everything was different. The world was luminous. He walked around for a while in this incredible world, vibrating even higher, and then discovered he could will himself anywhere on the planet just by imaging a destination in his mind. He traveled everywhere he could think of. He tried finding his friends, but couldn't. But then he discovered another ability. By imaging just a blank field in his mind, he could travel off the planet into a place of pure ideas. While there, he could create anything he wanted just by imaging it. But then he realized that a constructed world such as that was not a fulfilling place. Just creating what he wanted did not provide any inner satisfaction. He could eat and sleep even though he didn't have to, as well as interact with other people of higher awareness. So yeah, you just read all that. That's pretty bizarre stuff. In this place, he could only see other people that had vibrated to his frequency. That's why he couldn't find his friends. But if this is strange, this is just the beginning. It gets even stranger and more interesting. And when I read this and when Will showed up, I was so ecstatic. I remember thinking, oh my God, Will's back. This is amazing. And yeah, I was so thrilled. I don't know if you remember Will from the first book, but he was like the ultimate friend. I mean, the guy travels between dimensions. Will's afterlife revelations continued. After realizing his abilities, he went home and tried to figure out what he wanted to do now that he had these powers, and using them didn't bring satisfaction. He realized he had forgotten about the thrill of evolving and experiencing coincidences. He had become so buoyant, he mistakenly thought he was maintaining his inner connection, but had instead become too controlling and lost his path. It is easy to lose one's path at that high level of vibration because it is so easy and instantaneous to create with one's will. So he then focused within, looking for a higher connection with the divine energy, just as he always had, and that's all it took. Once he did this, his vibration rose even higher, and he began to receive intuitions again and saw an image of the main character. We learn that it's not about willing things into existence. In the afterlife, you can make anything happen by wishing it so, but this is not fulfilling. The secret is that on Earth, we can will and create almost anything we wish, but real fulfillment comes only when we first tune into our inner direction and divine guidance. Only then do we use our will to move toward the potential futures we've received. We become co-creators with the divine source. We are learning to use our visualization in the same way it is used in the afterlife, and when we do, we fall into alignment with that dimension, and that helps unite heaven and earth. This is bringing our birth vision to this dimension. Do you recall, like as a kid, wondering, if you're in heaven and you could just create anything you want, it would get pretty boring pretty quick. Well, Will kind of experienced the same thing when he was in that other dimension and he could just create anything he wanted. He said it was unfulfilling. The hum. Now, you remember I said the hum is a repeating occurrence throughout the book? So Will notices the sound of the hum mentioned in the previous chapter. Will said the hum could be heard in the afterlife dimension as well. The souls were disturbed about it. Was the hum related to the technology? The hum gets louder while Will and the main character are in the afterlife dimension, which we'll cover in part 3. The hum starts to affect the afterlife dimension too. The area of the afterlife where there are other souls. Will moved into an area of the afterlife where he could see other souls or groups of souls. He couldn't speak to them, but he could pick up on their thoughts and knowledge. This will be continued in part 3. This part was the return of Will, and part 3 is Will bringing the main character into the afterlife dimension, and they get to observe a life review. The 10th Insight, Chapter 2, Reviewing the Journey, Part 3, The Afterlife. The main character's visions. He sees Charlene's face when Will was speaking, and Will was able to see the main character's vision and describe Charlene back to the main character, and decides he's got to take him to the afterlife dimension. Will brings the main character to the afterlife and shares knowledge of the 10th. As Will fades in and out of this realm, he shares his energy to help bring the main character into the other realm, the afterlife dimension. While they're there, they recreate the image of Charlene together. He mentions we are learning to recognize and believe in our intuitions at a higher level. We all want the coincidences to come more consistently, but for most of us, this awareness is new, and we're surrounded by a culture that still operates too much in the old skepticism, so we lose the expectation, the faith. What we're beginning to realize is that when we fully pay attention, inspecting the details of the potential future we're shown, purposely keeping the image in the back of our minds, intentionally believing, when we do this, then whatever we are imaging tends to happen more readily. The main character's description of traveling into the afterlife dimension. He mentioned a wild acceleration, streaming at fantastic speeds through a multicolored tunnel of some kind. He had no fear. He experienced a sense of recognition and contentment and peace as if he had been there before. He found himself in an environment of warm, white light. He saw Will illuminated from within and telepathically communicated with him. The environment was spatial and had a sense of up and down, but they were suspended motionless in midair, and there were no horizons. White light, constant hue in all directions. The observation point. The souls observe the people who come over after death. It is the place people come right after they die. The main character was concerned about being amongst the souls and wasn't sure if he could trust them, and Will said they operate just like people on Earth. The main character sees a man who recently died and was able to experience how that man died and his thoughts, how he was just jogging and then had a heart attack and was able to witness the aftermath and how he was unable to communicate with the rest of the people and how he was kind of shocked to discover that he had just died and how he was trying to process the reality. They saw the guy try to use the powers of the afterlife dimension to recreate the world he was just in, deluding himself of his death. The souls consulted him and they moved on. Let me tell you, this really comes close to what I remember from dying in a previous life. You don't have to believe me, but man, reading this just now, I'm like, the author, James Redfield, he was really onto something. This is, I recall this. I don't know if you guys do, but man, this seems very familiar. All of this afterlife discussion so far is what I remember. But again, I wrote a book. I remember choosing my life in the afterlife dimension. I called it the afterlife dimension based on the 10th Insight, failing to realize everybody hadn't read the 10th Insight. But this description really reflects much of what I remember. The life review. John Donald Williams was the guy who had just died, and he goes through a life review. He sees his birth circumstance, parents, etc. He sees how all of the people were put in place for him to overcome his control drama. There were signs along the way for him to slow down, and he ignored them. He discovered that he failed again in this life to the need for recognition just as he had done in a previous life. He saw another previous life, which took place in the Appalachians, and in the vision, the white woman that the main character had envisioned was in it. It involved the economic expansion and the killing of the Native Americans and the reasoning for it. He also saw what had happened, the violence of silence and not listening. The battle witnessed in the afterlife took place in the Appalachian Valley of the previous chapter, a century earlier. The life review, I remember having a life review when I died and before I chose the life that I have now. And this birth circumstance, when I chose my life, the one that I have now, they showed me my parents and described them to me and how it would impact my life and the world that they would create for me. This chapter is so close to what I remember, it's ridiculous. I don't even know if James Redfield realizes how much on the head he hit the nail on the head. And maybe he's presenting this as fiction, but maybe he remembers just like I remember and is just presenting this as fiction. But man, this is so close to what I remember. The life review's significance as reported by Will. The increased awareness of this review process is having a great impact on human culture. It's another part of the higher perspective provided by a knowledge of the afterlife. Thousands of people have had near-death experiences, and as their stories are shared and talked about, the reality of the life review is becoming part of our everyday understanding. We know that after death, we have to look at our lives again, and we're going to agonize over every missed opportunity, over every case in which we failed to act. This knowledge is contributing to our determination to pursue every intuitive image that comes to mind and keep it firmly in awareness. We're living life in a more deliberate way. We don't want to miss a single important event. We don't want the pain of looking back later and realizing that we blew it, that we failed to make the right decisions. And here's something about this life review. I remember being like a 2-year-old toddler, and this is before school, before learning about religion, before being, accustomed to society. I remember if I got in a fight with a kid, like a kid fight, I remember thinking, that's fine. You'll pay for it later when you die. Yeah, it sucks. It's going to be like 70 years from now, but you'll pay for this then. And, as a toddler, you're fresh out of the afterlife dimension, not even 2 to 3 years removed from it. I barely had language, but I inherently understood karma. The group of 7. It appears as if the main character and John Donald Williams are connected together in a past life in the group of 7. That was to help resolve the fear. Well, we went a little over because I interjected my own commentary, but that is chapter 2. This chapter was incredible. The afterlife dimension really impacted my life. At some point, I'll get around to narrating my original book. I remember choosing my life in the afterlife dimension. This chapter really, really comes close to what I remember. I even made some mention of it in my book, The Simulation Theory, as well as a couple other videos that I made throughout my channel. So I always try to sprinkle it around because this is my birth vision, is to tell people that I remember choosing my life in the afterlife dimension, which hopefully will create a voluntary existence understanding, and that'll be the name of the next book I publish. But chapter 2, this was phenomenal. I did not realize the profound impact that the 10th Insight has had on my life until rereading it tonight. Man, chapters 1 and 2 were just amazing, especially chapter 2, the journey through the afterlife dimension. Made me realize that that's where I got the name, and I always remembered it, but I thought it was from the Celestine prophecy or the original 9 Insights. But the first book I had published was I Remember Choosing My Life in the Afterlife Dimension. What I failed to realize is that the world hadn't read the 10th Insight. So that's why they didn't understand what I was talking about. But man, that chapter 2 is something else. I'm so glad I'm rereading this book right now because, man, it is profound. Profound. Loving it.